Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Chelsea had already missed her chance to escape Allison, and this revelation cuts into the expectations fans once had about the young heiress. She had always been painted as someone who might secretly carry a fire within her, a survivor in disguise. But when the chains clamped her wrists to the iron frame of the bed and the darkness of the room swallowed her breath, she showed nothing of that fire. She cried, she pleaded, and she broke down at the exact moment her family would have hoped she could resist. The audience had thought Chelsea might play a dangerous game of charm or manipulation to buy time, but the opposite unfolded. Her attempt to speak only sharpened Allison's rage, and every word Chelsea stammered out became another reason for Allison to tighten her grip on control. It wasn't the physical strength Allison wielded that shocked people most, it was the psychological cage she built around Chelsea. A prison that no pleading could weaken. The Dupree family's wealth had long insulated them from the raw terror of helplessness. Generations had lived in privilege, operating under the assumption that problems could be handled with resources, lawyers, or quiet deals. Chelsea embodied that bubble, a fragile emblem of her lineage. But here, chained and trembling, her wealth meant nothing. Allison didn't care who her father knew or what kind of empire her family managed. The cries of the Dupree heiress were a kind of music to her, the sound of power reversed. Chelsea, for the first time, had no tool, no influence, and no mask to hide behind. And because of this, every second of her captivity carried an acidic irony. She was not just a victim, but an example of what happens when strength has never been demanded until it is too late. Allison understood this better than anyone. She thrived on Chelsea's weakness, fed on the very contrast between expectation and reality. When Chelsea begged, Allison laughed. When Chelsea tried to scream, Allison's hand pressed hard across her mouth with the kind of calm brutality that chilled the air. "You don't get to decide," Allison whispered, and the words curled into Chelsea's spine like a blade. From that moment, Chelsea stopped trying to outwit her captor. She did not even manage the instinctive tactic of playing along, pretending submission to buy time. Instead, she unraveled, letting panic consume her. That unraveling only emboldened Allison, who now held not only the key to the chains but the blueprint of Chelsea's soul. Meanwhile, the Dupree family's search sputtered forward like an engine without fuel. The investigation, even in its earliest hours, suffered from distraction and confusion. They clung to fragments of evidence that seemed almost irrelevant. Was it a neighbor who saw a shadow near the Dupree estate? Was it a staff member who went missing for a short time that afternoon? Every whisper became a lead, and every lead collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. They lost precious hours circling around the wrong names, chasing illusions of suspects that had nothing to do with the reality of Chelsea's imprisonment. Allison, cunning and cruel, had built layers of deception to obscure her tracks. She made sure the Duprees saw trails that led nowhere. She planted small false signals, pulling investigators toward meaningless suspects. One of her most chilling tricks was leaking subtle hints of Chelsea's disappearance in places where the family would be sure to look but never find a thread leading back to her. It was a game, and she played it with a patience that revealed she had studied her prey far longer than anyone realized. The one break in the suffocating confusion came not from the Duprees themselves but from Joey, a figure who always hovered on the margins of dangerous deals. Joey knew something about Craig, something that pointed closer to Allison's orbit. Yet Joey was never the type to offer information freely. His life was built on exchanges, on the cruel arithmetic of give and take. He agreed to speak, but only with a condition. And that condition became the pivot upon which the next stage of the hunt rested. Kat believed she could negotiate directly with Joey, but she underestimated him. Joey was not someone she could corner with her badge or her authority. He had a way of seeing through people, of knowing exactly where their desperation lived. So Kat, for all her determination, found herself powerless in front of him. She needed Martin, and Joey knew it. Martin was the one Joey wanted in the room, the one whose shadows Joey could use. Martin carried a weight inside him, a memory that refused to release its gripe. The death of Kenny. Kenny's end had been violent, unjust, and Martin had never forgiven himself for it. Joey understood this weakness with surgical precision. He pressed on it, reminded Martin of it, and used it as a lever to pry apart his defenses. Martin wanted to resist, but in Joey's world, nothing came without a price. To get Chelsea's location, Martin would have to bend, to ease the strict rules that had always governed Joey's underground games. The implication was clear: Joey would use this bargain to expand his power, even if it meant destabilizing the fragile order that kept blood from spilling in the streets. Smitty knew better than anyone how dangerous this was. He had spent years watching Joey maneuver, manipulating men who thought they were stronger than him until they were caught in traps they could not escape. When Smitty heard that Martin intended to meet Joey, his stomach turned. He warned him, pressed him, reminded him that Joey was no ordinary dealer of information but a predator in disguise. Still, the situation forced his hand. Chelsea's life outweighed principle, outweighed safety, outweighed everything. Smitty hated it, but he also knew there was no alternative. While this dark bargain formed in the underworld, another battle simmered among the investigators themselves. Jacob, seasoned and cautious, clashed with Kat over the pace of the search. Jacob argued that Chelsea had been missing for only a matter of hours, and in cases like these, patience often mattered as much as speed. Leads had to be verified, ground covered carefully. Acting rashly meant wasted energy, false starts, and possibly stepping into traps. But Kat was deaf to caution. She had seen Allison's madness up close, or at least she believed she had glimpsed enough to understand what Chelsea faced. For Kat, every second ticked louder than the last, every minute another wound Chelsea could be suffering. The debate between them was more than professional, it was deeply personal. Jacob represented the calculated side of investigation, the belief in method over emotion. Kat, however, was driven by fear, by an emotional urgency that gnawed at her reasoning. She could not shake the image of Chelsea alone, chained, and helpless. She pushed harder, demanded risks, and clung to Martin's willingness to meet Joey as a victory. For her, this was not a compromise but a breakthrough, a chance to finally pierce through the fog Allison had spread. But Smitty's eyes told a different story. When he looked at Martin preparing for his meeting with Joey, he didn't see hope, saw doom. He saw a man walking willingly into the clutches of someone who would twist his grief, his guilt, and his loyalty into shackles. "You're not facing a man," Smitty muttered once to Kat when Martin was out of earshot. "You're facing the devil himself." Kat brushed it off, too consumed with the possibility of finding Chelsea. Yet the warning lingered like smoke in the air, a reminder that this rescue mission was not only about saving a victim but about surviving the monsters that hunted in plain sight. Back in the hidden chamber where Chelsea remained, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Allison's control was absolute, not through constant violence but through unpredictable bursts of cruelty. Sometimes she would leave Chelsea in silence for hours, locking the door and vanishing, letting fear gnaw away at the edges of her mind. Other times she would stand close, whispering things Chelsea could not bear to hear, mocking her weakness, dissecting her family's inability to find her, predicting how long it would take before Chelsea broke completely. It wasn't just physical captivity, it was psychological warfare. And Chelsea, raised without the tools to fight back, spiraled deeper into despair. Still, there were flickers, moments so faint they barely registered when Chelsea thought she might resist. A glance at the chain's lock, a memory of a hidden lesson about staying calm under pressure, a fleeting idea that perhaps she could bargain with Allison after all. But these sparks never lasted. Allison always sensed them, always crushed them before they could ignite. Chelsea's tears were her confession, and Allison relished every one of them. Outside, the Duprees scrambled between hope and frustration. For every supposed lead that Kat brought to the table, Jacob countered with doubt. For every hour Martin devoted to preparing his approach to Joey, Smitty questioned whether they were moving closer to Chelsea or falling deeper into Joey's trap. And in the center of it all, Chelsea's life ticked away in shadows, her cries unheard except by the one person who wanted them most. The path forward was dangerous and unclear, but the pieces were in motion: Joey's condition, Martin's guilt, Kat's urgency, Jacob's caution, and Smitty's fear. All of them converged toward the same terrible crossroads, where one choice could mean Chelsea's salvation or her final silence. And beyond the gates that Allison had built, A darker truth was waiting to be revealed. The uneasy bargain with Joey dragged Martin into darker waters than anyone around him had anticipated. What began as a simple exchange of information in return for a loosening of restrictions on Joey's gambling operations soon turned into something far more corrosive. Joey had a way of weaving his claws into Martin's conscience, drawing out that festering guilt over Kenny's death until it consumed every decision Martin made. The deal was no longer about Chelsea alone. It became a test of how much Martin was willing to sacrifice in order to rescue her. And though he walked into it with the determination of a man trying to save a life, he soon realized Joey was turning the rescue into a negotiation of souls. Smitty watched the changes in Martin with mounting dread. His old friend had once been unshakable, a man who knew the boundaries between survival and corruption. But now, each meeting with Joey left Martin's face drawn, his voice tense, as if every conversation carried invisible chains. Smitty tried to intervene, to remind Martin that Kenny's death wasn't his burden to carry alone, but Joey poisoned those reminders, twisting them until Martin almost welcomed the punishment Joey inflicted on him. To Smitty, it felt as though they weren't merely bargaining for Chelsea's location, they were walking into a snare designed to bind Martin permanently to Joey's will. Kat, meanwhile, saw Martin's concessions as progress, not downfall. She wasn't blind to Joey's ruthlessness, but her desperation to bring Chelsea home clouded her perspective. Every scrap of information Joey released felt like a step forward. She catalogued his hints, cross-checked his whispers with their scattered leads, and convinced herself they were finally inching closer to the place where Chelsea was being held. To Kat, the mounting cost on Martin's soul was an afterthought. What mattered was Chelsea's safety, and if Joey's manipulation was the price to pay, she was willing to accept it. Jacob, however, refused to stand by silently. His disapproval sharpened into open conflict, especially as Kat pushed harder for aggressive action. He argued that Joey's information, while tantalizing, was designed to serve Joey's interests more than theirs. Every detail he offered came with strings attached, and Jacob suspected those strings would pull them further away from their objective, not closer. To him, Allison's madness was dangerous, yes, but rushing headlong into Joey's labyrinth was another form of madness altogether. The fractures within their group deepened. Kat accused Jacob of paralysis, of caring more about procedure than about Chelsea's life. Jacob countered that Kat's recklessness risked not only Chelsea's life but all of theirs. Smitty found himself caught between them, trying to steady Martin while holding the fragile alliance together. The rescue mission had become a battlefield of its own, with loyalty and trust eroding under the weight of fear. Inside her prison, Chelsea's spirit diminished further with each day. Allison alternated between cold detachment and calculated cruelty. Sometimes she brought food, setting it down without a word, her silence more terrifying than her insults. Other times she pressed close, her voice dripping with venom as she reminded Chelsea that her family was still floundering, still searching in the wrong places. She seemed to know their moves as though she were watching from inside their ranks, predicting when Kat would make a bold choice or when Jacob would hesitate. Chelsea began to believe that Allison was untouchable, a phantom no one could outwit. Chelsea's only flicker of hope came from overhearing fragments of Allison's mutterings. At times, Allison spoke to herself about Craig, the one name that Chelsea had not yet understood but which seemed to connect to Allison's obsession. Though she lacked the courage to question Allison directly, Chelsea clung to that name like a secret key. If she could survive long enough, maybe Craig would be the thread her family needed to unravel the nightmare. The turning point came when Joey demanded a gesture from Martin that went beyond easing restrictions. He wanted a piece of territory long held under Martin's protection, a symbolic surrender that would mark Joey's ascent. Smitty argued furiously against it, warning Martin that once Joey owned that territory, there would be no return. But Joey had dangled the one thing Martin couldn't resist, the location of a safe house connected to Craig. It was the first concrete lead that hinted at Allison's network, and Martin couldn't turn away. The meeting to exchange that information dripped with tension. Joey played the part of the gracious broker, delivering his clues with a smile that never touched his eyes. He described the safe house, its location on the outskirts, and the kind of people who had been seen entering and leaving. Kat latched onto every detail, already sketching out the operation in her head. Jacob remained skeptical, convinced they were being baited. Smitty watched Martin's silence and knew that his friend was losing more than he admitted. The lead might lead to Chelsea, yes, but it might also lead to ruin. The raid on the safe house unfolded in a blur of violence and uncertainty. Kat pushed the team to strike quickly, her fear for Chelsea overriding Jacob's call for patience. They broke in under the cover of night, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. What they found inside wasn't Chelsea but evidence: chains, scraps of fabric, traces of someone who had been held there but moved. Allison had abandoned the site days before, leaving just enough behind to mock them. For Kat, the discovery was proof they were closing in. For Jacob, it was proof that Joey had orchestrated the move, feeding them a trail Allison already knew they would follow. The argument between them erupted again, louder and sharper than before. Kat refused to see manipulation in Joey's clues, while Jacob insisted they were dancing on strings. Martin said little, but his silence spoke volumes. She was too far entangled in Joey's web to admit his doubts aloud. Smitty felt the danger rising like a tide. He understood what neither Kat nor Jacob seemed willing to acknowledge: Joey and Allison were playing parallel games, and Martin was becoming a pawn in both. The search for Chelsea had become not just a hunt for a victim but a collision of predators, each manipulating the rescuers for their own ends. As the days stretched on, Allison grew bolder in her torment of Chelsea. She began to bring news of the outside world, not as reassurance but as poison. She described the raid on the safe house, painting it as a comedy of errors. She mocked Kat for her impatience, Jacob for his hesitation, Martin for his weakness, and Smitty for his misplaced loyalty. Chelsea didn't know how Allison learned these details, but hearing them shattered what little faith she had left in her family's rescue. If Allison could predict their every move, how could they ever reach her? Yet Allison's arrogance carried its own cracks. In her need to dominate Chelsea, she revealed fragments of her own fiercer obsession with Craig, her hatred of betrayal, her paranoia that Joey might someday cross her. Chelsea listened carefully, gathering each piece like broken glass, fragile and dangerous but still capable of cutting through the darkness if used at the right moment. The Duprees, unaware of the psychological battle unfolding inside that hidden room, pressed onward. Joey offered them another lead, this one tied more directly to Craig. But his demands escalated with it, pushing Martin to the edge of surrender. Smitty pleaded with him to step back, to recognize that Joey was tightening the leash. Jacob argued that pursuing Joey's information was a mistake. Kat, consumed by the image of Chelsea suffering, urged them to press forward no matter the cost. The group stood at a crossroads, their unity shattered, their trust fraying. Every decision carried the weight of Chelsea's life, but also the risk of falling deeper into the trap Allison had set. And as the shadows lengthened, it became clear that the battle was no longer only about rescuing Chelsea. It was about who among them would survive the games being played, and whether the cost of salvation would leave them broken beyond repair. The fractures between Kat, Jacob, Smitty, and Martin reached their peak when Joey demanded one final concession. It wasn't territory or money this time, it was loyalty. He wanted Martin to stand by him publicly, to legitimize his operations in a way that no one else could. In return, Joey promised not only Craig's exact location but also the guarantee that Allison would be cornered. The offer was irresistible, yet poisonous. To accept meant betraying every principle Martin had once lived by. To refuse meant leaving Chelsea in Allison's hands, a victim slipping further into despair. Smitty, worn down by weeks of anxiety, confronted Martin in private. His voice trembled not with fear but with rage born of helplessness. "You've already given him too much," he hissed. "Joey doesn't want Chelsea free, he wants you bound to him forever. If you take this last step, you won't be rescuing her, Martin. You'll be burying yourself." Martin listened, shoulders heavy, eyes hollow. He wanted to argue, to claim that Chelsea's life justified every compromise, but the words wouldn't come. Deep down he knew Smitty was right. Yet he also knew that turning away now would haunt him more than Kenny's death ever had. Kat sensed the tension but pushed harder, unable to see beyond Chelsea's suffering. She painted Joey's offer as the final bridge, the only path left," Jacob countered, his tone cold and precise, warning that Joey's guarantee was nothing more than a performance. The two clashed so violently that Smitty feared the group would fracture before they ever reached Chelsea. Meanwhile, Allison tightened her grip. She spoke of Craig constantly now, revealing in fragments that he had once betrayed her, that Chelsea was her living pawn in a revenge far older than anyone realized. To Chelsea, these revelations were both terrifying and oddly grounding. For the first time, she saw Allison's rage not as unstoppable madness but as a scar, a wound that still bled. And in that wound, Chelsea glimpsed a weakness. She began to speak less, to cry less, to watch more. Her silence unnerved Allison, who thrived on Chelsea's despair. When the Duprees finally moved on Joey's last lead, the night crackled with dread. They arrived at a decrepit warehouse near the edge of the docks, a place Joey swore Craig had used as a meeting ground with Allison. Inside, they found signs of recent occupation: footsteps in dust, scraps of food, the faint smell of cigarettes. The tension was unbearable. Kat rushed ahead, convinced Chelsea was near. Jacob held back, scanning for traps. Smitty stayed close to Martin, whose breathing was shallow, his hand trembling on his weapon. Then came the voice, Allison's, echoing from the shadows, mocking them with the calmness of a predator that knew the hunt was already decided. Chelsea appeared in the flicker of a dim light, chained but alive. Her eyes widened at the sight of her rescuers, but her expression carried something new: quiet strength born from her observation of Allison's weaknesses. The standoff that followed was brutal in its simplicity. Allison didn't plead or threaten. She promised that if they came closer, Chelsea would die before they reached her. Promised that Joey's betrayal had already begun. Promised that every step they had taken to this point had been under her control. Kat wanted to charge forward. Jacob raised his hand to stop her, knowing it was exactly what Allison expected. Smitty tried to pull Martin back, whispering frantically that this was a trap. But Martin, caught between Joey's strings and Allison's shadow, stepped forward anyway. What happened next would be debated by everyone who survived. Some would say Martin confronted Allison directly, his grief over Kenny twisting into reckless courage. Others would claim he struck a bargain in that final moment, offering himself in Chelsea's place. Whatever the truth, the outcome shattered the night. Shots rang out, chains clattered, and screams filled the air. Chelsea emerged, bruised but breathing, her hands trembling as the chains finally fell. Kat rushed to her, tears streaking her face, relief spilling out in broken whispers. Jacob stood guard, his weapon steady, eyes scanning for Allison's return. Smitty cradled Martin, whose fate hung by a thread, his sacrifice marking the final price of the search. And Allison? She vanished into the dark, her laughter lingering like smoke. No body was found. No final confirmation of her defeat. She remained a ghost, a threat that promised to rise again. Joey, too, slipped away, his victory not in Chelsea's rescue but in the Martins' collapse. The Duprees had won back their daughter, but they had lost their anchor, and the shadow of the deals they made would haunt them forever. Chelsea's return to the world was not triumphant. She carried scars, not only from the chains but from the knowledge of her own helplessness. She had faced her weakness, been broken by it, and only in the final moments found a glimmer of resilience. Her family, once her shield, now felt like strangers, each of them marked by the choices they made in her absence. The ending was not closure but fracture. Chelsea was alive, but Allison was free. Martin's soul was either broken or gone. Kat carried guilt for every reckless choice. Jacob carried the bitterness of being ignored, and Smitty carried the weight of watching his warnings come true. The story closed not with celebration but with the haunting realization that beyond the gates of rescue lay another prison, one built from secrets, betrayals, and the lingering shadow of Allison's laughter.